"He's not good enough to even clean the floors," someone jeered loudly as a dark-skinned woman stood frozen in the center of the airport terminal, dozens of passengers watching in silence. A crumpled dollar bill lay at her feet, thrown there like trash, while laughter rippled around her like a tide. Phones lifted, recording her humiliation, capturing every second of her quiet refusal to kneel. They thought she was powerless. They thought they could break her. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with or how fast their world was about to fall apart. If this story moves you even a little, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe for more real stories that need to be heard, and drop a comment. Which moment hit you the hardest, and where are you watching from? We would love to hear your voice here. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass walls of Atlanta International Airport, casting a warm golden hue over the bustling terminals. Passengers scurried about, their rolling suitcases trailing behind them like obedient shadows, their faces set with determination, excitement, or simply exhaustion. Among the crowd, moving with a calm, almost unnoticed grace, was Diane Moore. Dressed in a simple navy blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, Diane carried herself with a quiet authority that most mistook for meekness. She approached Gate 47, a clipboard tucked under her arm, a polite smile gently resting on her lips. Today was unusually busy. A series of weather delays had pushed multiple flights into overdated monitoring schedules, and tensions among passengers were already running high. Diane's job was to ensure the safety protocols were maintained across the boarding gates in her section, a task she performed meticulously. As she moved behind the counter to check the updated manifests, her presence barely registered with the passengers pressing in, tapping impatient feet, barking into phones about missed meetings and ruined vacations. It was then that Mr. Carter appeared, an imposing figure in an expensive tailored suit, flanked by a group of similarly dressed colleagues. They laughed too loudly, their confidence filling the terminal like an unwelcome fog. Carter tossed his boarding pass onto the counter with a careless flick of his wrist. "Get us sorted, will you?" he said without looking at Diane, his tone steeped in entitlement. Diane picked up the boarding pass carefully, scanning it with a professionalism that went unnoticed. "Of course, sir," she replied smoothly. Behind her polite demeanor, however, a storm of familiarity brewed. This wasn't the first time she'd been treated like invisible furniture. As she processed the boarding details, another voice chimed in. A woman in the group, Amanda, her blonde hair perfectly styled, glanced disdainfully at Diane and murmured just loud enough for her friends to hear. At least they still let people like her work behind counters and not flying the planes. Laughter rippled through the group, a cutting sound that pierced deeper than any shouted insult. Diane kept her expression neutral, fingers steady on the keyboard, but inside, a knot tightened in her chest. Nearby, a young mother juggled a stroller and two toddlers, struggling to manage her boarding pass and diaper bag. Diane immediately moved to assist, helping the woman scan her pass and usher her forward with a warm, genuine smile. But even this small act of kindness didn't go unnoticed by the wrong eyes. Liam, one of the airline's ground supervisors, leaned against a nearby pillar, arms crossed, watching Diane with a look of thinly veiled disdain. "Always playing the saint," he muttered under his breath to a coworker, who chuckled nervously but didn't disagree. Diane heard them, of course. She heard everything. Years in the aviation industry had sharpened her senses to every slight, every whispered judgment. An announcement blared over the intercom. "Flight 318 to Houston now boarding at Gate 47. Diane adjusted the microphone and, with her usual poised clarity, called the passengers forward. As they lined up, Mr. Carter's group pushed ahead, cutting in front of a family with young kids. No one dared to challenge them. Carter smirked as he passed Diane, his eyes glinting with smug superiority. "We have important meetings. You understand, right?" he said, not as a question but as a dismissal. Diane simply nodded and scanned his ticket. "Have a pleasant flight, sir," she said, voice even and composed. Moments later, Amanda pretended to trip near the counter, spilling her designer coffee onto the polished floor. She looked directly at Diane and sneered. "Little help here?" The tone made it clear this wasn't a request, it was a command. Diane knelt, pulling paper towels from behind the desk, cleaning up the mess without a word. Her movements were efficient, devoid of the servility Amanda seemed to crave. As Diane disposed of the towels, Amanda snapped a photo on her phone, whispering to her friends with a gleeful look. "Look at her. Should send this to one of those people of airports meme pages." More laughter. More murmurs. The gate area grew increasingly crowded as more flights were rerouted through Gate 47. Diane worked through the chaos, her efficiency like a quiet hum in the background. Yet, despite her competence, every interaction seemed to carry an undercurrent of dismissal or derision. A businessman barked at her when he didn't hear his boarding group called. An elderly woman looked at her badge and said, "Oh dear, do you know if someone official is nearby?" A child asked loudly if Diane was the cleaner. None of it was new. None of it was surprising. And yet, each microaggression added weight to her day, like stones slipping one by one into her pockets. Diane remained calm. Her father's words echoed in her mind, a mantra she clung to when the world tried to diminish her. Your dignity is not up for negotiation. She finished checking the last group of passengers, closing the gate behind them. As the plane taxied away, she gathered her papers, double-checked the next incoming flight's details, and prepared for the next battle in an endless war of perceptions. She stood a little straighter, adjusted her blader, and moved toward the next gate without complaint. Outwardly, everything seemed normal. The airport bustled, announcements buzzed, children cried, lovers reunited. But in the shadows of these ordinary moments, cracks formed, cracks in the surface of professionalism, cracks that threatened to split open and reveal an ugly, festering reality beneath. Diane knew better than anyone that the worst injustices didn't always come screaming. Sometimes, they whispered sweetly, cloaked in civility. And sometimes, they gathered, slow and heavy, until the weight of them could no longer be ignored. Today felt like one of those days. The terminal buzzed louder as Diane moved from Gate 47 to Gate 49, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm, her shoulders squared as if physically carrying the weight of invisible stairs. The subtle hostility of the morning had thickened into something more palpable, something that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Diane could feel it prickling along the back of her neck, but she focused on her breathing, on the routine, on the small, concrete tasks she knew how to execute flawlessly. Precision was her armor, excellence was her shield. She had just completed checking the boarding gate systems when Amanda reappeared, latte in hand, her designer bag slung casually over her shoulder, the epitome of effortless entitlement. Diane spotted her instantly. Amanda's walk wasn't one of urgency but of theatricality, the kind that demanded attention without needing to ask for it. As Diane typed a note into the terminal log, she caught a flash of movement from the corner of her eye. Amanda accidentally brushed her elbow against her coffee cup, knocking it to the ground in a deliberate, slow-motioned arc. The cup bounced, splattering creamy coffee across the pristine tile floor near Diane's shoes. The liquid spread in an ugly brown stain, and gasps sounded from a few bystanders who immediately pretended not to see when Amanda fixed Diane with sickly sweet smile. "Oh dear," Amanda said in a voice dripping with mock concern. "Could someone—" She gestured vaguely toward the spill, her perfectly manicured hand fluttering like a lazy bird. "Maybe clean that up?" She didn't even bother to look around for assistance. Her gaze locked onto Diane, expectant measurement. Diane hesitated for the briefest second, just long enough for the humiliation to crackle in the air. The implication wasn't subtle. The message was clear. Diane wasn't a staff member overseeing safety procedures. In Amanda's eyes, she was the cleaning lady, someone meant to be on her knees scrubbing the floors under the 8 heels of the self-appointed elite. And just in case the onlookers had missed the point, Amanda added with a mock sympathetic tilt of her head, "After all, the floor is exactly where you belong, isn't it?" Laughter, soft and cruel, rippled from Amanda's companions who lingered nearby, pretending to be absorbed in their phones but very much part of the performance. For a moment, Diane's chest tightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Years of restraint screamed at her not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her dignity crumble. She bent down with mechanical grace, pulling paper towels from the side station, wiping the spill with swift, efficient motions. She was neither slow nor apologetic, refusing to allow Amanda's narrative to shape her reality. Amanda stood above her, sipping a fresh coffee she'd procured from somewhere, her lips curving into a victorious smirk. It was a tableau too perfect for her Instagram feed, if only she dared to snap a photo. As Diane rose, tossing the soiled towels into the nearby bin, she caught sight of Liam standing a few feet away near the check-in counters. His arms were crossed, his posture loose, but his eyes were sharp, hawkish. Liam had always been careful, too careful, to hide the depth of his disdain, but today he seemed emboldened by the general atmosphere. He leaned closer to his colleague, a wiry young man named Seth, and in a stage whisper that wasn't as private as he thought, he muttered, "Seriously, why is she even stationed here? Should have kept her in maintenance or cleaning. Let's be honest, she's more at home on her knees than behind a desk." Seth chuckled nervously, darting glances around to see who might have heard, but Liam didn't care. His voice carried, enough for Diane to catch every syllable despite the din of the terminal. Diane's back stiffened imperceptibly. She didn't turn. She didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted her blazer and smoothed down her clipboard against her side like a soldier checking their armor before battle. Her throat burned with unspoken words, but she swallowed them, letting the taste of them fortify her resolve rather than weaken it. She knew Liam thought he was invincible, protected by years of silent complicity from management and peers alike. Diane had seen his type too many times to count the kind of man who mistook his mediocrity for superiority, simply because the world had never forced him to confront it. But not today. Today, Diane told herself she would endure, not because she was powerless, but because the right moment was coming. She could feel it now, as surely as a seasoned sailor felt the coming of a storm in the pit of their stomach. Overhead, a flight delay announcement crackled over the intercom, fueling the already simmering frustration among passengers. Several began crowding the gate, their voices rising, their tempers shortening. Amanda rolled her eyes dramatically, tapping her stilettos against the tile. Mr. Carter paced nearby, his phone glued to his ear, his voice loud as he berated someone, likely a poor assistant on the other end, for his impending tardiness. Diane worked quickly, pulling up updated flight statuses, coordinating with operations on her earpiece, ensuring that despite the chaos, safety standards would not falter. But through it all, she felt the stares, the whispers, the lingering gazes that spoke volumes. "You don't belong here. You're not one of us. Stay in your place." She absorbed them all like a silent sponge, filing them away in the cold, methodical corners of her mind where she kept receipts. Every condescending laugh, every sneer, she tucked them neatly into the growing ledger of injustice she carried within her. And even as Liam and Seth exchanged smirks, even as Amanda strutted past, tossing her empty coffee cup onto a chair for someone else to clean, even as Mr. Carter barked orders at invisible minions, Diane kept working. Because Diane knew something they didn't. They were playing checkers on a board she had built for chess, and she was just getting started. The minutes ticked by, but for Diane, they stretched into an endless parade of humiliations, carefully disguised as normal. Every time she finished coordinating with operations or calmly assisting passengers, she would catch the sidelong glances, the tight smirks, the not-so-subtle whispers from Amanda's clique and the front counter crew. It was a silent chorus of contempt humming beneath the polished surface of airport efficiency. Diane kept moving, kept executing each duty with a precision that belied the storm swirling inside her chest. She wasn't new to this game. She had survived it 1,000 times before. But today felt different. Today, the disdain was no longer whispered or hidden in half-shielded smirks. Today, it stepped boldly into the light. It began when Mr. Carter, already frustrated by the flight delay and eager to demonstrate his perceived superiority, marched up to the counter where Diane was speaking into her headset, coordinating a baggage transfer. He planted himself in front of her with the aggressive energy of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. Slamming his briefcase onto the counter, he said louder enough for every waiting passenger to hear, "Excuse me, but can we get some more appropriate for this area?" His voice, sharp and dripping with disdain, cut through the ambient noise like a knife. Heads turned. Conversations still. Even the distant clink of luggage against the tile seemed to fall silent. Diane blinked once, setting down her clipboard carefully, willing her voice to stay steady. "Sir, how can I assist you?" she asked, her tone professional, neutral, unyielding. Mr. Carter gave an exaggerated glance around, as if struggling to find someone competent in a sea of incompetence. "Look," he said, gesturing to the growing crowd behind him. "This is a premium boarding area. We expect a certain level of quality service. Maybe you would be better suited to handling, I don't know, maintenance or technical operations. Somewhere behind the scenes, You understand?" His smile was chillingly polite, almost friendly, but his words struck like stones hurled at glass. A murmur rippled through the gathered passengers, a mixture of uncomfortable laughter and low gasps. Liam, standing not far from the exchange, smirked openly, exchanging knowing glances with Seth. Diane's breath caught for half a second in her throat. Not because she was shocked, she had always known this was how they saw her, but because the insult was so public, so nakedly cruel. Her ears rang with the familiar gaze. She met Mr. Carter's eyes squarely, giving him no satisfaction, no apology. Before she could respond, Amanda, never one to miss an opportunity to pour salt into a wound, flipping it casually to selfie mode. Diane noticed the glint of the screen in her peripheral vision, the exaggerated pout Amanda made as she framed Diane in the background, carefully adjusting the angle to make her appear smaller, lower, somehow less than human. "Say hi to TikTok," Amanda trilled sweetly, pretending to wave. She planned her phone mockingly across Diane's face, zooming in cruelly on her airport badge. As she recorded, Amanda's voice rang out, saccharine and cruel. "Here we have an example of how to fail upward. When you don't make the cut anywhere else, they let you supervise the floor. Sheriff Lure's staff, promotion, pity party." The people around them chuckled, some uncomfortably, others with open amusement. Diane could feel the heat of 100 eyes boring into her, measuring her worth, judging her not by her credentials or her discipline, but by the color of her skin, by the assumptions stitched into the fabric of their privileged lives. She heard a mother whisper to her teenage daughter, "Don't record it, it's mean." But neither of them intervened. No one intervened. Diane stood utterly alone, a statue carved from restraint. Amanda's friends clustered around her phone, giggling as they watched the live recording, adding laughing emojis and snide comments while tagging each other. Diane watched all of it out of the corner of her eye, while maintaining her posture, her professionalism and her armor. She would not give them what they wanted. She would not let them taste her anger, her hurt. Instead, she calmly pressed the call button on her headset, alerting the operations manager to prepare an incident report. Her voice was even as she requested additional support at Gate 49 for a developing disturbance. No emotion, no trembling, just protocol, just a procedure. Mr. Carter, emboldened by the apparent lack of consequences, leaned in closer and added, as if sharing a friendly piece of advice, "If you really cared about keeping this job, sweetheart, you'd know your place." Diana's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. Amanda's phone hovered, recording it all, capturing every moment for the world to mock. Inside her chest, something shifted. It wasn't rage. No, that would have been too easy. It wasn't despair either. It was colder, sharper, more deliberate than either. It was a calculation, a click of tumblers inside a vault she had been keeping sealed for years. Diane smiled then, a small, almost imperceptible smile. The kind of smile that warriors wore when they recognized that the final battle had begun. Across the terminal, she spotted a senior security officer approaching, drawn by the silent alarm Diane had triggered minutes ago when Amanda first raised her phone. His gaze scanned the gathering tension, his eyes narrowing as he caught sight of Amanda's recording and Mr. Carter's aggressive posture. Diane straightened her blazer, stepping slightly to the side as if making room for the inevitable confrontation. She knew what was coming. She had planned for it long before Mr. Carter ever decided he was important enough to humiliate her. Today wasn't just another day of quiet endurance. Today was a day the cracks would start to split wide open. And it had only just begun. The ripple of tension that had spread across the terminal after Mr. Carter's public humiliation attempt did not subside. Instead, it curdled into something uglier, something that fed upon itself and emboldened others. It was as if Diane's silent dignity, her refusal to bend under pressure, had become an open invitation for those who thrived on cruelty to push even harder. Amanda and her friends continued snickering behind their phones, their recorded video already pinging through group chats and social media accounts. But the real escalation came not from them, it came from a different corner of the crowd, from a man who had been watching everything with a sneer of quiet disdain. Mr. Reynolds, an elderly white man in his late 60s, rose slowly from his seat near the window, straightening his pressed khakis and adjusting his golf cap as he ambled toward the counter where Diane stood. His gait was casual, almost leisurely, but there was a gleam in his eye that set Diane immediately on edge. She knew that look. She had seen it before in boardrooms and back alleys alike, the predatory gleam of a man who smelled blood in the water and couldn't resist, taking a shot of his own. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat dramatically as he approached, drawing attention to himself and ensuring a small audience witnessed what was about to unfold. Diane turned to him with her usual professionalism, the practiced mask she wore daily when dealing with passengers both kind and cruel. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I assist you?" she asked, her voice steady. Instead of answering, Mr. Reynolds reached into his pocket with exaggerated slowness, pulling out a single crumpled $1 bill. Holding it between two fingers, as if the very act of touching it disgusted him, he leaned forward and dropped the bill onto the ground at Diane's feet. The sound of the bill hitting the floor was almost imperceptible, but the action itself was deafening. It hung in the air, a statement louder than any shouted slur. "Pick that up for me, will you, sweetheart?" he said, his voice carrying the lazy authority of someone who had spent his entire life ordering others around without consequence. A few gasps broke out among the nearby passengers, but no one intervened. Some turned away uncomfortably. Others watched with grim fascination, as if witnessing a car crash they were powerless or unwilling to stop. Diane stood frozen for a moment, the muscles in her jaw tightening. She stared at the crumpled dollar bill on the floor, then slowly lifted her gaze to meet Mr. Reynolds' smug, expectant smile. For a brief heartbeat, she considered playing along, picking up the bill with a cold smile and handing it back to him with crushing politeness. But something inside her refused. Something long-caged rose up and refused to bow. "No, sir," Diane said, her voice low but clear, like the spirit. "I am not here to pick up your money." A hush fell over the nearby cluster of passengers. Amanda, sensing fresh material for her phone, immediately started recording again, her eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. Mr. Reynolds' face darkened, his hand clenched into a fist before relaxing again, and he let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "That's what's wrong these days," he said loudly, turning to the crowd as if inviting their agreement. "Respect, no work ethic. You people think you're too good to do honest work." He pointed at Diane accusingly, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon. "You see that? This is why standards are falling everywhere. You can't even get decent service anymore." Another passenger, a woman in her 40s with a designer handbag and an icy stare, stepped forward from the growing crowd. Her name was Mrs. Whitman, and she looked Diane up and down as if appraising a particularly disappointing piece of merchandise. "I think we should report her," Mrs. Whitman said crisply, speaking over Diane's head as if she were an object rather than a person. "Clearly she has no respect for paying customers. Her attitude is completely unacceptable." The words struck like physical blows, but Diane did not flinch. She stood tall, her back straight, her chin lifted, even as the accusations began to snowball. Another man chimed in, with someone Diane didn't recognize, someone emboldened by the momentum of public cruelty, adding, "I've flown through this airport for years and never seen service this." Voices layered atop one another, some muttering in agreement, others murmuring in embarrassed dissent, but none strong enough to halt the growing tide. It wasn't about spilled coffee anymore. It wasn't about a $1 bill. It was about power, about punishing someone who refused to accept the inferior role they had been silently assigned. In the midst of it all, Diane remained a still point in a churning sea. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the collective judgment, the collective condemnation. But she also felt something else, something far stronger. The silent promise she had made to herself as a child echoed louder than the jeers. "You are not what they say you are. You are not what they think." Still, the situation demanded an immediate decision. Diane knew she couldn't allow the scene to spiral further, not without losing control of the broader operation. A delayed boarding process could risk more than her pride. It could endanger flight schedules, security protocols, and hundreds of passengers relying on her unseen leadership. Calculating her next move with icy precision, Diane reached for her radio, her fingers brushing the emergency code that would summon upper management to the gate without broadcasting a full alarm. She caught Liam's eye across the terminal. He was grinning now, arms crossed, enjoying every second of her public dressing down. Seth hovered nearby, less confident but unwilling to break ranks. Amanda's phone hovered steadily, no doubt live-streaming the humiliation to anyone who cared to watch. Mr. Reynolds stood smugly by the counter, rocking slightly on his heels as if already savoring his imagined victory. But Diane didn't look at them. She kept her eyes forward, her movements calm, even as inside she felt the molten roar of injustice building to a breaking point. Because Diane knew something none of them knew. She knew the tide was about to turn. The doors seemed to pulse with the heavy tension that had coiled itself around the scene. Diane remained still at the counter, her hand calmly resting near the silent call button on her radio, while around her, the noise of complaint and condemnation grew louder. She could see Mr. Reynolds smirking, Amanda gleefully angling her phone to capture every humiliating moment, and Liam standing back with a look of smug triumph, arms crossed over his chest like a king surveying a conquered land. But Diane knew. She wasn't conquered. Not yet. Not ever. The crowd around the gate had thickened, passengers craning their necks for a better view of the brewing scandal, phones lifted discreetly to record, eyes gleaming with the ugly thrill of watching someone brought low. And then, slicing through the murmur of gossip and judgment, came the sharp click of high heels against tile. A hush fell over the gate area as Miss Jenkins, the airport's senior gate supervisor, strode into view. Miss Jenkins was a tall, imposing woman in her early 50s, her hair pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun, her dark blue uniform pressed to military precision. She moved with the confidence of someone who had spent her life climbing the ladder, and whose first instinct was always to defend the system that had allowed her ascent, even at the expense of those beneath her. She took in the scene with a quick, practiced glance. Diane standing calmly, the crumpled dollar still lying untouched on the floor. Mr. Reynolds watching smugly, Amanda recording openly, and a crowd hungry for blood. Her face hardened instantly. Without even requesting an explanation, without asking a single question, Miss Jenkins advanced toward Diane with the momentum of a hammer falling onto an anvil. "Miss Moore," she barked, her voice echoing across the terminal. "Step forward." Diane obeyed, her posture composed, her heart a slow, heavy drumbeat in her chest. She knew what was coming. She could read it in the stiff set of Miss Jenkins' shoulders, in the narrowed eyes that refused to see nuance or context, only disruption. "You are here to serve." The passengers snapped, voice rising just enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. "To create drama, not to embarrass this company, and certainly not to refuse a simple request from a paying customer. If you don't have the heart for service, Ms. Moore, you should find another line of work." A collective intake of breath rippled through the spectators. Amanda's smile widened, drinking in every second. Mr. Reynolds puffed out his chest, vindicated. Liam nodded slightly, satisfied. Diane stood very still, feeling the humiliation settle over her like a suffocating blanket. Every word Miss Jenkins had said hit harder than any slap could have, and it was meant to. Diane's mind raced, not with panic, but with the careful calculations of someone who had been playing a much longer, much deeper game than anyone around her realized. She could feel the judgment pressing down on her like a lead, but she refused to be bowed. She refused to let them break her, even now, especially now. A small voice suddenly cut through the tension, a voice pure, unfiltered, too young to be tainted by the "Mommy," said a little boy's voice from somewhere near the front of the mic. Diane turned slightly, spotting him, a boy no older than 7, white laney older, hair falling over his forehead, his small hand clutching the hem of his mother's skirt. His wide, innocent eyes were locked on Diane, filled with confusion. "Why is that lady getting yelled at? She didn't do anything bad. She was just standing there." The boy's mother is a thin woman with a tight expression, clutching a designer tote against her chest, bent down slightly, her face twisting into a pained smile. She patted the boy's head, avoiding Diane's gaze. Her answer was soft, almost apologetic, but it carried a weight far heavier than she probably intended. "Not everyone," she said carefully, "is a good fit for nice places like this." The boy frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the explanation. His gaze lingered on Diane, filled with a kind of raw, instinctive compassion that none of the adults around him seemed capable of expressing. But his mother gently turned him away, guiding him back toward their boarding lane. And just like that, the small flicker of innocence was swallowed by the grim machinery of prejudice. Diane's heart twisted painfully, not from the boy's question, but from that was how it started. That was how the next generation learned to see others not by what they did, but by what they were told they did not belong. Ms. Jenkins continued her lecture, oblivious to, or perhaps fueled by the public nature of her humiliation. "You will submit a written incident report before the end of your shift," she barked, pointing a manicured finger at Diane's chest. "And if there is another complaint, you will be suspended pending review. Is that understood?" Diane said, her voice steady, devoid of inflection. She would not cry. She would not break. She would not let them see an ounce of weakness. Satisfied she had reasserted her authority, Ms. Jenkins turned sharply on her heel and began issuing orders to clear the crowd and resume normal operations. Diane stepped back behind the counter, her hands steady, her breathing slow and deliberate. Around her, the passengers began to drift away, conversations rising again, laughter and idle chatter weaving back into the fabric of terminal life as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But something had happened. Something had shifted irrevocably beneath the polished tiles and the false smiles. Diane felt it thrumming under her skin, coiled tight and ready. Because the storm wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. The aftermath of Ms. Jenkins' tirade settled over the terminal like a dense fog, muting the colors, dulling the chatter, leaving everything heavy and still. Diane returned to her station without a word, her movements precise, her composure unbroken, despite the heat of humiliation still simmering in the air. Around her, passengers resumed their business, some pretending nothing had happened, others stealing furtive glances filled with judgment or pity. None offered help. None spoke on her behalf. Silence, as always, was complicity's most reliable accomplice. Ms. Jenkins didn't leave immediately. She lingered near the counter, speaking sharply into her radio, coordinating with someone unseen. Diane pretended not to listen, but her ears caught every clipped syllable, every coded word that spelled out her fate. "Temporary suspension," Jenkins said, her voice crisp and emotionless, effective immediately. "Escort her from the floor. We'll begin a formal review tomorrow." The words didn't surprise Diane. In fact, she had expected worse. She stood with dignity, placing her clipboard neatly on the counter, smoothing her blazer with calm, measured movements. When a junior supervisor, a young man barely old enough to shave, approached with an awkward, apologetic glance, Diane nodded once, signaling she understood without the need for his stammered explanation. Amanda, sensing opportunity like a vulture circling wounded prey, practically leapt into action. She whipped out her phone, recording Diane as she gathered her few belongings from behind the counter. "And there you have it, folks." Amanda crowded loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear, her phone angled dramatically for maximum effect. "Cleaning up the trash, one gate at a time. Dignity check." Diane said nothing. She gave them no reaction, no flicker of pain or anger to feed their narrative. She walked steadily toward the staff exit, her steps even and unhurried. The junior supervisor trailed behind her, his discomfort palpable but unimportant to Diane now. She had bigger concerns, bigger moves already unfolding behind the thin, plastic smiles of those who thought they had won. As she passed through the wide glass doors separating the secure employee areas from the main terminal, Diane felt the eyes following her, drinking in the image of her departure like a victory parade. Liam leaned casually against the wall, watching her go with a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Amanda's phone gleamed under the fluorescent lights, no doubt already uploading the latest clip to her eager audience. But Diane didn't falter. She kept walking, her mind focused on the steps ahead, not the jeers behind. She reached the staff-only corridor, a stark, sterile hallway lined with maintenance closets and locked security offices. Here, the air smelled of industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. Here, the real heart of the airport pulsed unseen, unfelt by the passengers who believed the world revolved solely around their comfort. She stopped just short of the final checkpoint, where the security badge readers flashed green and red in rhythmic alternation. From the pocket of her blazer, Diane pulled a slim, unmarked black device, no bigger than a hotel key guard, and held it up to the scanner. The light blinked twice, paused, then turned a solid green. A soft chime echoed overhead. The corridor speakers crackled to life, carrying a calm but unmistakably serious voice across the entire airport. "Attention all personnel. Level 2 security protocol has been initiated. Please remain at your assigned stations and await further instructions. All boarding and deploying operations are temporarily suspended pending safety verification." The announcement repeated in Spanish and French, each syllable slicing through the ambient noise of the airport like a scalpel. A wave of confusion swept through the terminal. Passengers froze mid-step. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones were lifted, texts were sent, questions erupted in panicked whispers. Gate agents began scrambling to calm the crowds, paging supervisors, while pilots peered out from cockpit doors with furrowed brows. Amanda's laughter died abruptly. She lowered her phone, glancing around nervously as the gravity of the announcement sank in. Liam straightened from his lazy sprawl against the wall, frowning as he watched the orderly chaos unravel across the floor. Ms. Jenkins barked orders into her radio, her face tight with barely contained frustration. Meanwhile, Diane remained perfectly still, standing just inside the staff corridor, unseen by most, unnoticed by those too preoccupied with the sudden disruption to realize that the woman they had so recently mocked had just pulled the strings of the entire terminal like a seasoned puppeteer. Security teams mobilized instantly, moving with crisp, military efficiency. Their radios crackled with coded confirmations. Within minutes, checkpoint barriers were activated. No one in, no one out. The heart of the airport locked down with precision. Diane herself had designed years ago as part of a national security revamp following escalating threats, and now, in a twist none of her tormentors could have foreseen, Diane was the only one holding the master key. She slipped the black device back into her pocket and began walking again, her pace deliberate, her face serene, as uniformed officers moved to their posts, oblivious to the fact that they were responding not to some vague, external threat, but to the quiet vengeance of a woman they had just tried to erase. Every second that ticked by tightened the noose around the terminal's operations, forcing higher-level management, federal agents, and the head of airport security into rapid, frantic action. And they would all be seeking one person, her. The airport's normal rhythm collapsed into a symphony of alarm and confusion. Security teams swarmed the concourses, agents in navy blazers with Homeland Security badges moving swiftly, issuing crisp orders into their radios. Gate agents froze, passengers clutched their belongings in tight fists, and the murmur of panic grew into a low, urgent roar. Level 2 protocol confirmed active across all terminals, blared a voice through the hall. Passengers, please proceed calmly to the nearest exit for evacuation. Staff members initiate security lockdown procedures immediately. Amanda lowered her phone slowly, her previous triumphant smirk replaced by wide-eyed panic. Liam's face paled as he snapped upright, sensing that whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything he could understand or control. Miss Jenkins barked into her radio, trying to assert authority, but it was clear no one was listening anymore. The chain of command had shifted, pulled from her hands like sand slipping through desperate fingers. Diane walked calmly through the chaos she had unleashed, her badge flashing against the dark fabric of her blazer. But this time, no one jeered, no one laughed, no one dared to block her path. She moved with a certainty that seemed out of place amidst the rising panic, her steps measured, her head held high. To those scrambling around her, she was an enigma, neither victim nor bystander, orchestrating an invisible symphony. As Diane approached the main operations hub near the center of the concourse, a group of high-ranking security officers broke through the throng of panicking passengers. They moved with purpose, clearing a path through the chaos. Their radios buzzed with frantic chatter, but their focus was singular. Their lead was Chief Security Officer Harris, a man whose reputation for cold efficiency was known throughout the industry. His normally stoic face was taut with urgency as he scanned the crowd until his eyes locked onto Diane. Instantly, his entire demeanor changed. The officers behind him slowed, then stopped altogether, forming a protective semicircle as Harris stepped forward. Diane paused, unreadable. Harris came to a sharp, respectful halt a few feet from her, and snapped into a salute so crisp it seemed to slice the very air. "Director Moore," he said formally, his voice carrying over the din. "South Regional Airspace Control. It's an honor. We are at your full disposal." Gasps rippled outward from the closest onlookers, who could hear. Amanda, frozen mid-step, dropped her phone without even noticing. Liam's mouth fell open. Ms. Jenkins blinked, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Mr. Carter, standing further back near a security checkpoint, frowned in confusion, struggling to process what he was seeing. Diane nodded once, accepting the salute with the quiet authority of someone long accustomed to wielding power unseen. "Status update," she said coolly. Harris stepped closer, lowering his voice instinctively. "Primary terminals evacuated at 75%, secondary screening points secured. The AFA has been notified, awaiting your directive to proceed to full regional lockdown protocols if necessary." Stand by at current levels, Diana says uneven. We're assessing internal threats before proceeding further. Understood, ma'am, Harris replied crisply, signaling his team with a series of quick hand gestures. Within seconds, his officers were dispersing into tactical positions around the concourse, directing the flow of people, tightening security measures with the seamless efficiency of a well-drilled machine. Meanwhile, the evacuation continued at an accelerated pace. Families clutching suitcases moved toward exits under the firm but calm direction of uniformed staff. Boarding bridges retracted from planes. Departure screens flashed updates, made them mide, but no Patry. Experienced teams like Meredith, the airport's heart shuddered, slowed, then shifted into a new rhythm dictated solely by the unseen hand of Diane Moore. Amanda stumbled backward, bumping into a chair as she stared at Diane as if seeing her for the first time. "Director?" she whispered hoarsely, disbelief etched into every syllable. She wasn't alone. Other passengers, crew members, even low-level supervisors like Seth began to murmur among themselves, piecing together the shattering realization that the woman they had mocked, belittled, and humiliated was not just another employee. She was the architect of their entire environment. She was the one who could grant or deny them access to the skies themselves. Ms. Jenkins, looking as though she might be physically ill, took a faltering step toward Diane. "Director Moore," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I wasn't informed that..." Diane turned her gaze upon Ms. Jenkins, her expression cool, detached, lethal in its quiet finality. "You weren't informed because your clearance level doesn't authorize that information," Diane said, her words as precise and cutting as a scalpel. "Your responsibility was to uphold airport operational standards without prejudice, bias, or misconduct." Ms. Jenkins swallowed hard, the color draining from her face. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound emerged. Around them, security personnel in tactical gear formed tighter perimeters, their movements a constant, silent reminder of the gravity of the situation. Nearby, a group of federal inspectors, wearing suits with DHS insignias pinned to their lapels, arrived, walking with the heavy purpose of those accustomed to authority but equally trained to recognize it in others. They approached Diane directly, offering brief respectful nods as they awaited her command. "Prepare a briefing room," Diane said without raising her voice, but with a tone that brooked no argument. "We'll begin the formal review within the hour. I want all incident footage, personnel files, and security reports on my desk immediately." "Yes, ma'am," one of the agents said, already moving to comply. As Diane surveyed the terminal, her expression betrayed no triumph, no gloating. There was only purpose, only the relentless weight of responsibility borne by those who understood the true cost of leadership. She hadn't come to gloat, she had come to rebuild, and she was just getting started. The operations center transformed into a war room under Diane's command. Monitors flickered with live surveillance footage from every terminal, concourse, and gate. Teams of federal agents and airport executives bustled around, responding to rapid-fire orders with crisp "yes, ma'am" affirmations. Diane stood at the center of it all, poised and immovable, the gravity of her authority undeniable. Her presence alone dictated the tempo of the room. Everyone moved faster, sharper, more alert because she was there, because she demanded it without speaking a word. On a large screen in front of her, personnel files scrolled in real time. Every employee on duty during the morning's incidents had been flagged for immediate review. Diane's hand hovered over a tablet, scanned reports and video evidence with icy precision. Her mind was a finely tuned machine, analyzing patterns of misconduct, connecting timelines, cataloging every act of negligence and bias. She tapped the screen twice, highlighting a list of names: Liam Carter, Amanda Westbrook, Ms. Evelyn Jenkins, and Seth Miller, among others. Their offenses varied in detail but were uniform in theme: abuse of authority, discrimination, failure to uphold the ethical standards required by the aviation industry. Diane turned to Chief Security Officer Harris. "Initiate immediate disciplinary proceedings," she said, her tone tired of the proceedings, effective now. "All staff members identified in violation of ethical conduct policies are to be suspended pending full internal investigation. Their access badges are to be revoked. Escorted from secure areas under supervision." Harris nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Director." Within moments, uniformed officers moved out, spreading through the airport's restricted zones like silent predators. Diane didn't need to raise her voice or bang a gavel. Her authority was absolute, ratified by national security protocols, industry regulations, and decades of experience few could even comprehend. As Director of South Regional Airspace Control, Diane held the power not only to override airport management decisions, but to remove personnel whose conduct endangered the reputation and operations of the aviation system itself. And today, she would use that power without mercy. The screen updated again. Real-time feed from the main terminal showed Liam being approached by 2 security officers. His initial smirk faltered when they asked him to surrender his badge. Confusion twisted his features into a scowl. "What's this about?" he demanded, his voice carrying. The officers remained professional but firm. "Effective immediately. You are being relieved of duty pending a misconduct investigation authorized by the Director of Regional Airspace Control." Amanda tried to slip away unnoticed, clutching her phone and designer handbag to her chest like a shield. But another pair of officers intercepted her at the escalators, politely but firmly guiding her back toward the employee checkpoint. Ms. Jenkins, who had been barking useless orders into her radio only moments ago, was left pale and speechless as federal compliance agents approached her with a printed suspension notice. The contrast was stark. Moments ago, these people had moved with arrogance, believing themselves untouchable, believing they owned the narrative of the airport floor. Now, they were small, disoriented figures, swept up in a tide they couldn't even begin to resist. Inside the operations center, Diane continued issuing orders with methodical efficiency. "Ensure all electronic communications are preserved," she instructed the IT liaison. "Any deleted messages, unauthorized video recordings, or social media postings must be flagged and included in the investigative docket." "Already in progress, Director," the intelligent replied, tapping furiously. Diane nodded approvingly, her gaze sweeping the room. Her mind cataloged every detail: the chain of evidence, the sequence of events, the necessary documentation for a public accountability review. No shortcuts, no compromises, not this time. Standing at her side, Agent Lopez from the DHS Oversight Division cleared her throat gently. "Director Moore," she said respectfully, "in light of the magnitude of the breach today, would you like us to prepare federal ethics violation notices as well?" Diane considered for half a beat before responding. "Anyone found to have participated in, condoned, or failed to report discriminatory conduct will be held accountable under federal aviation ethics standards. Prepare the necessary paperwork." "Understood," Lopez said with a crisp nod. The operations center pulsed with a renewed energy, a palpable sense that justice, long dormant, was finally stirring awake. Diane knew better than anyone that leadership wasn't just about authority. It was about responsibility. It was about protecting those who could not protect themselves, about holding the line when others faltered. And today, she would not waver. On another screen, security footage captured Amanda's TikTok livestream being replayed for evidentiary review. Diane watched without flinching as Amanda's mocking voice filled the room. "Cleaning up the trash, lower staff." There it was, proof not only of misconduct but of a toxic culture that had been allowed to fester beneath the glossy surface of professionalism. Proof that for too long, people like Diane had been forced to swallow their dignity in the name of keeping the peace. Not anymore. She tapped another command into her tablet, sending immediate orders for a comprehensive retraining initiative on workplace ethics and anti-discrimination practices for all airport personnel under her jurisdiction. No one would ever again be able to claim ignorance as an excuse. As Diane finalized her directives, a low murmur of activity surrounded her staffers, and agents moving swiftly to execute her orders, supervisors scrambling to comply, the entire operational infrastructure bending to her will. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply did what needed to be done, because she understood the truth they had all forgotten. Respect isn't requested, it's commanded. And she was just beginning to show them how. Consequences rippled outward from the operations center like shockwaves after an earthquake. Diane's directories moved through official channels with ruthless efficiency, triggering a cascade of accountability that none of her former tormentors could have anticipated. Within hours, preliminary investigations yielded clear violations, and the repercussions began to fall swiftly and decisively. The first to feel the weight of Diane's authority was Mr. Carter. His name appeared at the top of the misconduct list reviewed by the Federal Aviation Ethics Board. A private meeting convened in a secured briefing room, where Carter was informed in no uncertain terms that his behavior constituted not only grounds for removal from the premises, but also a severe breach of passenger conduct protocols. The security footage, combined with multiple eyewitness testimonies, painted an undeniable picture. Public harassment, racial discrimination, and disruption of airport operations. Effective immediately, Carter's name was entered into the National Transportation Blacklist, a comprehensive database shared across all major airlines, airports, and federal transit agencies. For the next 5 years, he would be barred from boarding any commercial flight originating or landing within the United States. His travel privileges, once a symbol of his power and status, evaporated with a few keystrokes. Mr. Carter sat stone-faced as the agents delivered the news, his face pale, his fingers twitching against the table. He opened his mouth once to protest, but the agents silenced him with a simple, factual statement. Appeals are not permitted for incidents involving confirmed racial misconduct under federal aviation regulations. You have no standing to challenge the ban. In the terminal outside, word began to trickle through unofficial channels. Gate agents whispered behind desks. Flight attendants shared hurried glances. Carter's downfall became a symbol, a warning that the old rules of unchallenged privilege were being rewritten, and that the new architects of power answered to a higher standard. But Mr. Carter wasn't the only one facing swift and irreversible consequences. Ammon Westbrook, once gleeful in her cruelty, now found herself ensnared by the very tools she had used to humiliate others. Her viral TikTok video, which had mocked Diane with hashtags like lower staff and trash cleanup, exploded far beyond her control. At first, she reveled in the attention, watching her view count skyrocket, basking in the shallow glow of online infamy. But the internet has a way of prominent influencers began condemning her video as blatant racism. News outlets picked up the story, framing Amanda's actions as emblematic of systemic bias in elite travel culture. Hashtags like Justice for Diane and End Airport Racism trended across multiple platforms, drowning out Amanda's attempts at damage control. Her comments section became a battlefield of outrage and disgust. By the next morning, Amanda's employer, a major media conglomerate known for its polished image and public commitment to diversity, issued a brief but scathing statement. Effective immediately, Amanda Westbrook's contract with Vision Media Group has been terminated. We do not condone or tolerate behavior that contradicts our values of inclusion and respect. The news traveled like wildfire. Headlines plastered her face across every major feed. TikTok star fired after racist incident airport. Influencer faces fallout over viral mockery. Public shaming leads to career implosions. Sponsorships vanished, partnerships crumbled. Amanda's meticulously curated online persona unraveled in real time, each lost deal a nail in the coffin of her public life. In a matter of hours, Amanda transformed from a smug instigator into a cautionary tale. And Diane? She didn't have to lift a finger. Justice unfolded naturally, like a seed planted long ago finally breaking through the soil, blooming in the harsh light of accountability. Inside the operations center, Diane observed the fallout with a detached focus. She wasn't here for personal revenge. She wasn't interested in watching her tormentors squirm. Her purpose was larger, deeper, correcting a culture that had allowed such behavior to fester unchecked for too long. She turned her attention to finalizing the internal documentation, ensuring every report was airtight, every procedural step flawless. Federal auditors would arrive soon to conduct follow-up reviews. Public statements would need to be drafted carefully, balancing transparency with legal precision. Diane coordinated it all with the same meticulousness she had shown under fire years ago during national security emergencies. Meanwhile, across the terminal, the passengers who had once smirked and whispered now looked around with a newfound unease. The rules had changed. The balance of power had shifted, invisibly but irrevocably. In every corner of the airport, people were learning an important lesson. The smallest actions, the quietest humiliations, the seemingly invisible slights, they all mattered. Justice, once unleashed, did not discriminate in its reach. Mr. Carter's profile was flagged at every TSA checkpoint across the country. Amanda's social media accounts were flooded with thousands of comments demanding apologies she could no longer offer. Ms. Jenkins faced a pending ethics board hearing that could strip her of her credentials permanently. And Liam, stripped of his access badge and authority, stood outside the employee entrance, staring numbly at the locked doors, realizing too late that entitlement was not. The airport itself began breathing again, albeit awkwardly, painfully. Announcements resumed, flights reboarded, passengers returned to their routines. But the atmosphere had changed. A collective awareness lingered in the air, an invisible scar on the polished surface. Through it all, Diane remained the quiet architect of the new order, unseen by most, yet felt by all. Because real change never comes with fireworks or fanfare. It comes quietly, relentlessly, in the steady beat of consequences long overdue. And Diane's work was far from finished. In the days that followed, the airport slowly found its rhythm again. But it was no longer the same place it had been. A transformation, subtle yet profound, had taken root, and at the heart of it stood Diane Moore. The formal investigations continued, federal auditors cross-examining employees, retracing steps, analyzing failures. Headlines shifted from outrage to reform. Public apologies were issued by the airport authority, promising systemic changes, and for once the promises were not empty. The first visible shift came when Liam and Ms. Jenkins, once smug and unrepentant, requested a meeting with the Internal Ethics Review Board. At first, Diane had been skeptical, wary of shallow attempts at damage control. But when they stood before the panel, no cameras, no grandstanding, there was something different in their demeanor. Gone was the arrogance, the defensiveness. Liam's usual swagger was replaced by a quiet, almost awkward humility. Ms. Jenkins, once towering in self-importance, seemed smaller, weighed down not by defeat but by genuine remorse. Facing the board, Liam spoke first, his voice steady but raw. "I acted in a way that does not reflect the values we are supposed to uphold," he said. "I let bias cloud my judgment. I was part of the problem. I am sorry for what I said, for what I allowed to happen, and for every moment I stayed silent when I should have stood up." Ms. Jenkins followed, clearing her throat before beginning, her voice rough with emotion. "I failed," she admitted. "I failed to lead, I failed to protect my staff, and I failed to live up to the standards of respect and dignity this industry demands. No excuses, only the commitment to be better." Both of them, without prompting, agreed to enroll in the comprehensive anti-discrimination and bias awareness training program Diane had mandated for all returning employees. They agreed to participate in community service projects organized by the airport's Diversity Council, pledging not just words but actions to rebuild the trust they had broken. Their apologies were public, not hidden behind closed doors. A statement was issued, read aloud at a staff assembly attended by hundreds of employees and later broadcast on the airport's internal network. Diane watched from the back of the room, arms folded, faces unreadable, but deep within her, a seed of cautious hope stirred. Change was never perfect, never instant, but this was real. Weeks passed, the airport moved forward, new policies were enacted, new story. The air felt lighter somehow, not because the work was finished, but because the work had finally begun, in earnest. And then, one ordinary morning, as Diane strode through the main terminal, clipboard in hand, headset snug against her ear, she saw him. Mr. Carter. He was standing in the long, winding economy check-in line, clutching a battered carry-on, his suit wrinkled and ill-fitting, a stark contrast to the image of effortless power he had once projected. His phone was tucked away, his head bowed slightly. There was no entourage around him now, no air of superiority clinging to his frame. He looked smaller, diminished, not by the weight of public shame alone, but by something deeper. An understanding that had been forced upon him through loss, through consequence, through humiliation. As Diane approached, their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The deafening noises faded into a distant hum. Carter's gaze, once sharp and dismissive, now held something unfamiliar, something almost fragile. Regret. Recognition. A silent apology that words could never fully contain. And then, without hesitation, Mr. Carter did something Diane had never expected. He bowed his head slightly. Not decisively. Not theatrically. But with a sincerity that could not be faked. A gesture not of submission, but of respect. Diane regarded him for a long moment, her face unreadable, then gave the smallest of nods, a silent acknowledgement, not of absolution, but of understanding. A threadbare bridge spanning the wide, painful chasm of the past. She moved on without slowing her pace, her shoes clicking confidently against the polished floors, her clipboard tucked firmly under her arm. Behind her, Mr. Carter remained frozen, his head still bowed, as the line inched slowly forward. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a lesson had been carved deep into the bones of the system itself. A lesson about dignity, about power, about the invisible strength of those who refuse to be broken. Diane didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had rebuilt herself 1,000 times before. But today, for the first time in a very long time, she didn't have to do it alone. The world, at last, was learning to meet her where she had always stood upright, unyielding, unbreakable. And somewhere deep in the future, perhaps a little boy with wide eyes would remember the day he asked why, and when he grew up he would know the answer. Because dignity was not a privilege, it was a right, and Diane Moore had claimed it for them all. If you enjoyed this powerful story of resilience and justice, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content. We would love to hear your thoughts. Which moment in the story resonated with you the most? And where in the world are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. Your voice matters here.